Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Emily. Hi. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Langlands. I'm product manager for rendering and materials in NVIDIA's Omniverse platform, which is our platform for simulation for training robotic agents. Before that, I was a visual effects supervisor at Weta for many years. So I care a great deal about physically accurate lighting and materials. Some would maybe say too much. Of course, those people are wrong. It's impossible to care too much about physical lighting and materials. And I'm going to talk to you about lighting today in particular. So last year, I talked here about the problems in sharing lighting in OpenUSD. Using the Intel Moore lane scene as an example, the exact same USD layer here in different applications and different renderers is giving entirely different results. You can see like Arnold and RTX are like orders of magnitude brighter than Karma is on this scene. Now, no individual renderer is actually wrong here. The trouble was that UsdLux didn't actually specify what any of the light attributes actually do. You know, most of the concepts, like distant lights and cone angle, all these things have basically existed for about as long as computer graphics has existed. So everyone has a slightly different interpretation about how they ought to work, which is what leads to the massive differences in brightness that you see here. So to tease out those differences and figure out how to move forward, I built a test suite and comparison site, which was later improved and expanded upon by Paul Milodovich at NVIDIA. And we concentrated on RenderMan, Karma, and Arnold, as well as our own RTX renderer, to find like the biggest points of divergence, which we could then clarify. The reference renders in the far left column here are generated by a modified version of the HT-Embry render delegate that ships with USD that does direct lighting instead of ambient occlusion. And the biggest differences that we found were in things like emission from distant lights and handling of IES files. There's plenty more, like the orientation of textures applied to rect lights, how spotlight cone angle is interpreted, and as well as just overall consistency in whether individual renderers were actually combining these effects together at all, or some were working when others weren't. So with the differences identified, we updated the UsdLux documentation to specify exactly what the effect of each of the attributes is on the brightness of the light, with both formulae and textual descriptions. Criterion for choosing what we would do was basically like most common wins. And the HT-Embry delegate provides a matching reference implementation of those. For example, for the distant lights, the big difference there was that the interpretation of normalization. Like some renderers assumed that a distant light was always normalized by solid angle, and different renderers normalized in different ways. We now specify that with normalize off, the input intensity attribute is the emission luminance, and with normalize on, the emission should be normalized to hold illuminance constant according to the formula on the left there. This is actually slightly different from what most renderers do, but it has the advantage that it holds the brightness at the receiving surface constant as the angle of the light changes, which is kind of nice. It also makes for a very easy conversion of the light's brightness to units of lux, which we'll come back to in the second half of this talk. The IES shaping controls, the angle scale essentially squashes or expands the IES table to allow artistic control of the emitted distribution. And this control was handled very differently between different renderers, with RenderMan and Karma here essentially doing the exact opposite of one another. You can see that with negative values in the top left there in RenderMan, it's got a nice change of distribution shape, whereas for positive values on the bottom left, you've got this big gap that appears in the distribution because of the way the mapping was done. And then basically, Karma does the exact opposite. So Paul developed a new bimodal mapping that combines the best of the two so that the shape is controllable in both directions. These and all the other changes are now specified in the UsdLux documentation as of 25.05. So if you're a renderer author, please refer to that and the test suite at the links we have here for all the details to update your renderer to be conformant. The HT-Embry reference implementation is currently still in open PR, but hopefully that will be merged soon, right, Tom? Yeah, a thumb up, thank you. And with those changes implemented, lighting can now be consistent between renderers. So here we've got Karma on the left and Omniverse RTX on the right. There's some slight differences between the renderers, and the reason that it's all gray shaded is because USD preview surface interpretation is a whole different kettle of fish that we don't have time to cover. But you can see the lighting is basically exactly the same between the two. So it works. Yay, we're done. I'm pleased to say Karma will be supporting this as of Houdini 21, right, Mark? You're back there somewhere, which releases tomorrow? RenderMan will support it sometime in the RenderMan 27 series. And then an RTX will add support in a release in a couple of months' time. As well as specifying the behavior of each of the light attributes, we've also attempted to clearly specify the units and quantities involved. So this isn't actually changing anything. This is just grounding what everyone's already doing in real units. As a side note, if anyone's got a good name for the RGB equivalent of radiance, please let me know, as I'm not really happy with anything I've come up with so far. Of course, defining what the units involved in light transport actually are is meaningless unless you also define how the camera responds to light, i.e. how do we go from RGB luminance, or whatever we call it, arriving at the sensor, to pixel values in the generated image. And that's where the other new addition in USD 2505 comes in, which is the addition of exposure controls to USD GEOM camera. This adds exposure time, f-stop, ISO, and responsivity attributes to the camera schema, with the existing exposure attribute being repurposed as exposure compensation, which is what it did anyway. And so these attributes model how a real camera, like a DSLR or a digital cinema camera, generates output pixel values from incoming light energy. And they essentially make the units that we specified in UsdLux real by tying them to real devices that we can compare to and match the output from. So exposure time, f-stop, ISO, and compensation should hopefully be obvious to everybody here. They work exactly as they would on a real device, and they model kind of an idealized camera. So increasing exposure time, ISO, or compensation makes the image brighter. Increasing the f-stop makes it darker. Responsivity is the difference between an idealized camera and a real camera, and is there to account for things like transmission losses in the lens system, so the difference between f-stop and t-stop in a cinema camera, and sensor headroom. So it's the difference between what you would measure with a luminance meter and what the camera pixel values are. And that's exactly the way you'd measure it to find the right value for a particular system that you're interested in. So you just by shooting a chart with your device and taking the luminance of the pixels it generates, then measuring the exact same thing with a luminance meter, and then responsivity is just a ratio between the two. If you don't have a luminance meter handy or the setup to do experiments like that, then empirically we found a value about 0.65 to 0.7 is reasonable for DSLRs at least. Incidentally, this is the new real-time 2.0 mode in Omniverse RTX doing full path tracing in real time at 1440p with 32 bounces on Ada, the last GPU generation. If you want to know more about that, then stick around to the end. So for renderer authors, it's incredibly easy to add support for the exposure attributes to your renderer. We did all the math for you. I mean, it's not much math, but still, trying to be nice. All you need to do is call HD camera get linear exposure scale in your Hydra delegate, and then multiply your pixels by that value, and it all just works. The default values here models what's known as an EV0 exposure, so ISO 100, 1 second exposure time, f-stop of 1. And that, which is implicitly what most renderers do currently, which means that an incident luminance of 1 nit will generate an output pixel luminance value of 1. So in other words, it's backwards compatible by default, so there's no reason not to add it to your renderer today. Being able to control the camera exposure is critical if you want to use meaningful values in your lighting. Real-world scenes cover like a vast dynamic range, and trying to use real light values with an EV0 exposure will just result in completely blown out lighting for anything other than a nighttime scene. So with the camera exposure controls, we can have physically meaningful lighting values and a well-exposed image. But how do we set those physically meaningful lighting values? As we define the intensity attributes on a UsdLux light to be measured in nits. The sun has a luminance of approaching 2 billion nits. Trying to measure peak luminance of a real light source with a spot meter is extremely difficult, as emission varies so much over the source, let alone across the entire environment for an HDRI. So what we need is controls that are easy to measure or to find data from publications, and we need to be able to use just a single value to represent the brightness of the light and the whole brightness of the light. So instead of peak intensity, we want to know that the value that we set in the light is the actual total amount of light that's going to kick out, so that we can have it be physically meaningful. And that's what our new physical lighting proposal aims to solve. So this consists of schema for each light that adds photometric or radiometric attributes for specifying brightness. That's power on area lights and illuminance or irradiance on distant and dome lights. This makes it much easier to specify lighting in real known values rather than twiddling an intensity slider and trying to guess this stuff by eye. So for example, say we wanted to light this simple house set. This might be a set on an animation. In Omniverse, we might be using this, for instance, as part of like a city setup for an autonomous vehicle simulation. And we need to set up correct lighting so that all of the elements of the scene, like the environment lighting, skylights, interior lighting, headlights on the cars, all of that have the right relative brightness, and we need to be able to do that easily. So we might start, for instance, with an HDRI like this one I downloaded from Polyhaven. And if I put that onto the dome light, that looks pretty good. It looks quite sunny. But if I switch to the interior camera, now, if you're a lighting artist or done any photography or anything photography adjacent, this should be making your eye twitch right now. Because the balance between the inside and the outside is completely out of whack, right? The interior is about as bright as the exterior, which is lit by the sun. And in fact, the spots on the cupboards up there, on the top right of the image, are using measured values from the lighting manufacturer. So I know that they're outputting the correct amount of light, which means that the HDRI is way too dark. And that kind of makes sense, right? Like most any HDRI you download from the internet or even create yourself in something like PT-GUI is going to be balanced around the middle exposure, generally speaking, which means they're balanced around EV0, which, as we saw earlier, is very, very dark. And just to hammer the point home, here's another HDRI shot at a different time of day. So this is at dusk from the same location. And they look about the same brightness, right? Whereas the one on the left should be hundreds and hundreds of times brighter than the one on the right. So if we can't rely on the values in the HDRI, how do we set realistic values for the lighting? Well, I know from experience that if I were standing outside on a clear sunny day around noon, where I live in New Zealand, with a lux meter pointed straight up, then I'd expect to measure somewhere between 100 and 120,000 lux. If you don't have a lux meter handy, you can find out that information out relatively easy. Like Wikipedia has a handy guide, which is mostly correct in my experience. In Omniverse RTX, we have an illuminance AOV, so I can measure how much light the top of the roof here is getting, and that tells me that that point where the mouse cursor is on the top of the roof is getting about 6,000 lux, which is way too low as we expected. So what do I do? Well, I know I want 100,000 lux, and I have 6,000, and I need to divide by that, but I also need to take into account the intensity that's set on the dome light, and I'm doing a whole bunch of math in my head, and it's awful, and I just want to go to the pub. Why can't the renderer just do it for me? Which is exactly what the illuminance attribute in the physical dome light API does. I just set that to say 120,000, and the light is now emitting 120,000 lux onto upward-facing surfaces. What's actually doing under the hood here is that we integrate the illuminance that each pixel contributes to an upward-facing patch, including any color tint applied and the spectrum of the illuminant. And then we divide the light's brightness by this before multiplying up again by the photometric illuminance value. Now you might say, Anders, that's certainly brighter, but is it really 120,000 lux? And I say yes. But I can prove it to you by pulling up the illuminance AOV again and measuring it, but that's boring, right? A more fun way to do it is to take advantage of the camera exposure controls that we were just talking about. Again, so if you've done any photography, then you'll know the sunny 16 rule, which states that on a bright sunny day, with ISO 100, and you set the camera's exposure time to 1/100th of a second and the f-stop to 16, and you get a well-exposed image, which is exactly what we get here. So it works. If we move back inside using the same camera settings, we can see the outside is well exposed, but the inside is obviously super dark. Again, using the sunny 16 rule, we should just have to set f4, say, for shade, sunny day, and bam, now it's inside's well exposed. And it just looks naturalistic and correct, right? Because it is correct. And with zero effort on my part, other than just knowing a couple of easily discoverable values. So like the exterior is blown out as we expect. The spots are now barely visible on the covers, as you'd expect, because we don't tend to put lights in our kitchen that are as bright as the sun. And regardless of whether you're trying to set up like a city-scale AV simulation or you're just trying to make photorealistic images, getting that balance correct is incredibly important. And as I said, we don't have to sit and tweak things. We just put the right values in and it is correct. But let's say I wanted to add some more practical lights to the kitchen, like in those pendants over the bench there. So if I switch out the HDRI for the dusk version that we saw earlier, set the appropriate illuminance for that, and then adjust the camera ISO to brighten things up, now I've got a nice sort of like late evening lighting setup. Now I don't have measured values for those pendants like I did for the spots on the cupboard. I've just got a few disk lights tucked up in there. So how do I set their brightness? What do I do? Well, most bulbs you buy at the store nowadays have the lumens written on the box when you buy them. And like for something like that, I might put in a 1600 lumen bulb into the light. So I put 1600 into the power on the light, and nothing changes, which is because lights are diffuse emitters, so they're spreading all of the light out uniformly, and so most of that light energy is actually getting blocked by the inside of the pendant geometry. So I can just use the shaping API to focus that light forward, and now we're putting that same amount of energy straight down onto the bench as it would be in the real world, with a reflective surface inside the shade, and everything just looks as we expect, which is great. Similarly to the dome light, what's actually happening, but kind of opposite, what's actually happening under the hood here is that we're integrating over all the excitant directions over the entire surface of the light source, including the effect of all the attributes, like the size of the light, which is in meters, not in scene units, any textures applied to the lights, shaping controls, all of that stuff, which means that whatever attributes the user changes, the light will always be outputting the specified power. So you can kind of think of this is like the proper version of what the normalized flag is trying to achieve currently. And again, I didn't have to tune anything or have a photograph up that I'm trying to match to. I don't even have to have the pendants or any of these other pieces in the same scene while I'm editing them. I just put the real values in the lights and everything just works together. We just set up all the elements of the scene in isolation, which, for a city-scale simulation, there might be thousands and thousands of buildings with millions of lights, and set them all up in isolation and confident that when I bring everything back together again, it's just going to work because I'm using real values in the lighting. So for renderer authors, again, the proposal is to do all of the math for you and just give you simple methods to call to compute the necessary scaling factors. Exactly where this implementation would go is something I'd love to discuss. I mean, I've got it like HD light here, but I don't know if that's the best place, maybe not. It'd also be great to talk to all of you renderer developers out there about what's required to get this implemented, so that when we hopefully land this in OpenUSD, that everyone's ready to go. So find me or Luca afterwards to talk about that. As well as the photometric and radiometric brightness attributes, all of the light schema inherit from physical illuminance API, which specifies the illuminance spectrum of the light, which is essential for spectral and non-visual rendering. The default of white just uses the spectrum of the rendering color space, white point. It's worth noting that this is not well defined for ACES CG because they use chromatistic coordinates for the white point instead of a standard illuminant. So that's something to investigate how to figure out there. And we'd add a compute illuminant RGB method to HD light to get the RGB color from the illuminant for use in an RGB renderer. And this essentially sort of expands upon and replaces the existing color temperature controls in UsdLux. As I say, being able to specify the illuminant spectrum is very important for spectral rendering in particular. Some images from the 2020 talk that Luca and I did showing the difference between rendering with a full spectral distribution and the RGB equivalent. The physical camera responsivity API defines the spectral response of the camera sensor to red, green, and blue in the camera's native RGB space. This essentially collapses the entire raw to RGB chain, going straight from spectral radiance to output RGB. If you've got a spectral renderer, then you just use these curves instead of the CIE standard observer when converting from spectral to RGB. Then we provide a method on the camera to compute the camera RGB to XYZ matrix, allowing you to go from the camera RGB space to whatever RGB space you actually want to output. Even if you've only got an RGB renderer, I believe, but cannot prove, that using the camera native RGB as your rendering space will actually improve the quality, the accuracy of your renders. But that's something that needs further investigation. Here's an example of what that does in a spectral renderer, Manuka, again from our 2020 talk. So here's a plate that we shot in an Alexa. This is the spectral renderer using the standard observer as the camera response function. This is using the same exposure controls as we have in USD Drum Camera now, so the brightness matches, but the color is not quite there if you look closely. And then this final one is using the measured responsivity of the Alexa sensor. I don't know how well that plays on the projector, but hopefully you can see that it's much, much, much closer in color. Like it's a pretty bang-on match overall. So yeah, that's that. Thanks to Paul Milodovic and Matt Korek for helping with this at NVIDIA. Paul in particular took my prototype and checked and improved everything and turned it into a very impressive chain of PRs that could actually be merged. I want to thank Nick and Tom at Pixar for shepherding all of this work through. And most of this work is heavily based on Luca Fascione's Phys-like work in Manuka, which was developed together with a whole bunch of engineers and artists at Weta. The Weta Phys-like repository, which I'm linking here at the bottom, contains Luca's very long PDF going over all of the math, as well as Python notebooks that you can play around with to experiment with it for yourself. If you have thoughts on the physical lighting proposal, please comment on the PR. That's the one on the top left there. And then all the UsdLux standard stuff like the test suite and the gallery of renders that are generated are on those other links that you have there. And finally, if you want to find out how we're doing full real-time path tracing in Omniverse RTX, and if you're interested in rendering, of course you do, come to Ignacio's talk on Tuesday at 1 p.m. Thank you very much.